Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my 2025 season predictions, where I go through and predict where all of the 20 drivers will be in the drivers ranking, as well as the 10 constructors in their constructors rankings. And we'll have to determine a little bit about each of those people and drivers, as well as the constructors, and going through this list, trying to fit those together in a jigsaw puzzle like setting. As some things I would like to be higher, but then I have to figure out where the other people are going to be, or the constructors, and all of that regarding each other. And so it makes it really complicated to come up with a full list. If you haven't tried this before, I would appreciate you giving it a try and seeing if you can do better than I can, because I am pretty horrible at this, but it is pretty fun and in general for me to try to look at these things ahead of time. So instead of giving you 20 drivers, I'm going to give you actually 21 drivers, as I think Franco Colapinto is going to get a chance to sub or do some kind of function in that Alpine to, drive a couple of races, if not one at least, to get him in some points or to get him into that ranking ahead of some of these other drivers. So we'll have to watch and wait and see. I'm not sure if he will actually take over that driver's seat or if it'll just be a sub, but I think he's going to be at least on the drivers for the 2025 season, so I've included him here as well. We will start off with Barretto in that last spot. I think he's new coming into F1. It's not saying he's a bad driver. I just think he's with that stake F1, which is kind of lagging behind, and I think they'll lag behind the whole season. And since he's new, he's trying to learn as well, and so I think he'll be at the back of the pack. And right ahead of him, I have Isaac Hydjar in that RB. Again, I don't think he's necessarily a bad driver. I just think that he's coming in new, and so he'll be lacking some of that experience and some of that knowledge that comes to those veterans. And I don't think the RB is going to be actually up there as much as I would have liked to see them. I think they're going to be falling back into that pack. And so I think he's going to be in that roughly 20 marker. And then you have Nico Hulkenberg, who's in that stake. I think he's going to just outdo Isaac Hydjar just slightly in these runnings. And so I put him in 19th. And then we get Yuki Tsunoda, the veteran, over that RB. I think he's going to be able to get into that 18th position fairly easily, but it'll be a struggle to get up higher than that with that RB. In my viewpoint, I don't think they're bringing a lot to this 2025 season. I think they're kind of waiting for that 2026 season to really do a lot of changes and try to help elevate them into that mid-pack or front-running positions. And I get Oliver Behrman. I think it's going to be that back with that Haas pack there. I think he's going to do a decent job. I really like Oliver Behrman, but I don't think that Haas is going to be able to keep up with the Alpines and the Williams and potentially the Aston Martins as well. So I think they're going to be in that back of that pack there, and I think that's going to put him into that 17th position. And this is where I come in with Franco Colapinto into that 16th position. I think he's going to out-edge Oliver Behrman in that Alpine. I think that Alpine is going to be better than the Haas, and so I think I'm going to get him into that running. I think I put him just above Oliver Behrman in that running, even though he's just going to be in there as a sub in my viewpoint. Esteban Ocon, veteran of the drivers for the Haas this time, and he's going to out-edge Franco Colapinto, but he's not going to get much higher than that in the sense of the Haas in relationship with the other constructors. And then we get into 14th position, Jack Doohan. I think he's going to do a decent job. I think he's going to learn, but he's not going to be quite as good as Pierre Gasly in that running. He's still trying to learn the ropes, even though he's been a reserve driver. It'll be his first time to be a full-time race driver for the full season. So I think he'll lag behind us slightly. He'll be competitive, but he won't be able to edge out like Alex Albon in that Williams either. So I have him in that 14th position. And as I said, Alex Albon is in that 13th position with that Williams. I think Williams is looking a lot better than it did this last season. And with two big drivers in that Williams, I think they're going to be pushed up forward into that constructors ranking. So it's kind of hard to figure out exactly where they're going to line up. He actually may be ahead of Lance Stroll in this season, but we'll have to wait and see. Then I get Lance Stroll, of course, in that 12th position, kind of staying in that back of that pack. I think he doesn't have enough really drive to keep him motivated throughout the full season. So I think when Aston Martin kind of lags behind a little bit, he loses interest. and loses the focus that he really needs to be in that car to keep them up high enough along with his teammate. And then we get Pierre Gasly in that 11th position, just outside that top 10. I think he's going to do fairly well, but I think that top 10 is going to kind of out-edge him in that Alpines for the 2025 season. Now we get to the top 10, where I have Kimi Antonelli in that Mercedes in that last 10th position. I think he's new and he's going to be fast, but he's going to have a lot of mistakes in this F1 2025 season. So I have him back into that 10th position. I think he's going to learn a lot this season, and he'll be more competitive in the 2026 season as he gets his feet under him in this F1 machinery. But I have him, not quite as well as the likes of Liam Lawson and Carlos Sainz. So I think he's going to drop back into that 10th position. Speaking of Liam Lawson, I have him in that 9th position as he's a newcomer into that Red Bull. I don't think he's going to do quite as well as Max Verstappen. I think he's going to be semi-competitive, but that Red Bull is going to lack what it really needs throughout the full season. I think they're going to come out strong again this season, but I don't think the development's going to be there through the whole cycle as they've added a lot of little tiny parts, messing with all those aerodynamic surfaces, which is going to help them at the beginning of the season, but are they going to be able to maintain that throughout the whole season? I am not so sure of, and that's going to put them like in that area there that they're in. I think they're going to come out strong, and as the season goes, they're going to wane off again like they did this last season. Then I have the surprise here with Carlos Sainz coming in on 8th in that Williams. I think he's going to do a really good job. I think he's going to outshine Alex Albon, and I think he's going to really put a pressure on Alex, and he's going to show, even though they're going to be competitive, there's that really tight-knit group, I think, that's going to be really focused on, and I think he's going to be able to take advantage of those and be able to push himself up into that 8th position. And then we get wily Fernando Alonso in that 7th position. I think he is just the ability to be able to figure out the situations where he was in and make the most out of that. He's going to leave him into that 7th position overall. And with, some of those changes in Aston Martin, I think that'll help them out as well, even though it may take a little bit more time than I was originally thinking for them in this 2025 season. Then we come to Lewis Hamilton in that new Ferrari seat. Now, I had a hard time trying to figure out where he was going to be. He's a really great driver, and he's going to be able to really push on Charles Leclerc. But I think generally because he's coming into that new environment for Ferrari, he's going to lack a little bit of that edge that he had in the previous seasons, but he's going to be able to work his way back into that top area and be able to be competitive. So I have him into that 6th position, just behind Max Verstappen. Now, Max Verstappen came in and he is strong, and I think he's going to do fairly well, but he's going to lack a little bit in that Red Bull this season and not be able to keep up that 1st position, and he's going to drop down to that 5th. As I think a couple of other teams are going to be able to be strong in this 2025 season, where Red Bull is going to be more focused on that 2026 season than they are this last 2025 season of these rule sets. This leads us to George Russell into that 4th position. I think he's going to do fairly well again, but not quite as top tier as the rest of the last 3. So he's going to end up into that 4th position, just behind Oscar. I think Mercedes is doing decent, but they're still a little bit struggling from what I've seen in that practice sessions. So they're trying to get that car underneath them in the feeling that they need, not being too loose or too tight in those corners. And I think it'll take them that season to really get that grips on that. And of course, with the 2026 rule set coming up, it depends on how much they were going to really focus on this year versus kind of switching over to next year as well. And then I get to the McLaren, Oscar Piastri. I think they really want to focus on 2026, but I think they're kind of dedicated to 2025 as they were the Constructors' Championship in 2024. I think they want to, put that nail in there as well and be another 2025 Constructors' Championship, and potentially a Drivers' Championship along that, just to help motivate them into that new era. So I think they're going to focus a lot more on this year, and so that'll help them in this running. So I'll put Oscar into that 3rd position, just behind Charles Leclerc, who I think is going to do good in that Ferrari, but that Ferrari is still lacking a little bit, where the McLarens seem to be really stable and really kind of getting the grips, even though they had some big changes on that car this season, as far as I could see in the practice session. So I think they're going to be just edged out by the McLaren again this season. And again, I think the Ferraris will probably switch a little bit more to that 2026 season as well, trying to get the most out of the next season with all those rule changes versus this season, which is the last of this rule set. And this comes to Lando Norris, who I think is going to be able to edge out and become the driver's champion for this 2025 season. It's really hard to gauge between a lot of those drivers, but I think he's going to be able to work his way in and be able to get that confidence that he needs to edge out some of these other players in that, what better performing McLaren than those Ferraris and Mercedes and Red Bulls. So I kind of have him up there into that first position, and it'll be good to see him and see how he handles that pressure in that regard and going into the 2026 season as well. So this brings us to the constructors standing here. So the 10th through the 1st on the constructor standing. So it'll be good to see in 2026 a new team being added to this list. But right now we just have the 10 constructors. And I have Stake at the back of the pack. Again, I don't think they are going to make the adjustment that they need to get farther than that 10th position. Hopefully when Saudi comes in, they will be able to get a little bit more advantage of those resources and bump them up into that ranking. But right now I think they're going to stay into that 10th position. They didn't look like they made a big jump in that standing versus last year in the practice sessions, and I don't see them developing that car into the position that needs to be above that 10th marker as well this season. Then we have RB. I think RB is going to do decent, but I don't think they're going to be up there in that pack. I think they're going to focus more on 2026. And it didn't look like they really had their feet under them in that practice session. They're doing decent, but not super great. They didn't look like they're bringing a lot of new items to that RB car. So I think they're going to stay in that running and be into that 9th position, where I think Haas is just going to out edge them this season. It's hard to see how Haas is going to run. They have their little different test plans that they had in that testing, and those long runs look decent, but they didn't really look super amazing. So I don't have them pushing up farther in that running. And with 2 new drivers, I think they're going to have a little bit of development there. And so they'll be into that 8th position. And I think Alpine is going to do really good, but they're not going to quite edge out Aston Martin in that running, and they're going to stay into that 7th position. They have those 2 good drivers, and we have one, Jack Doohan, well, depending on how well he does versus, where his replacement may be, or maybe if he's going to be staying into that seat the full season. We'll have to wait and see. But I think Aston Martin's going to out-edge them through this season, but they're going to be close to the Aston Martins in that 6th position. And we see Aston Martin in that 6th position mainly because I think Adrian Newey coming into that team, being able to develop those aerodynamics potentially. I know he's going to be trying to focus on the 2026 car, but I think he's going to have his shift a little bit into this season and try to help that Aston Martin keep that 6th position in this running, be able to develop that Aston Martin a little bit towards those new rule sets and kind of get a gauge for how that Aston Martin's going to be overall. I think that's going to help them out in this running, but they're not going to be, in that top 5 plays out throughout this 2025 season. And I think the surprise here is going to be Williams with Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. I think they're going to do an amazing job. I looked fairly strong in the testing sessions. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to play out in the full season. But I think with those 2 excellent drivers and that new motivation behind the Williams, I think they're going to be able to really focus on the season and develop that car and get them up into that running just behind Red Bull in that running. So be into that 5th position. They're not really going to be competitive into that Red Bull, but they're going to be pretty decent there into that 5th position overall. Putting those markers up there ahead of them, kind of fall apart, and they can take advantage of those situations. Then we have 4th. Red Bull. As I said, I think they're going to start off the season strong, but they're going to wane off throughout the season because I don't think they're going to have the development they need for that Red Bull vehicle throughout the full season. They're going to focus more on 2026, and so that's going to make them lag behind a little bit and push them back into that 4th marker with the Mercedes and the Ferrari and the McLaren just ahead of them in that running, because I think they're going to be able to put more resources in for this season, where Red Bull is going to be probably focused more on the rebuilding and getting in that 2026 season ready for them. Mercedes, they're doing decent, but they're still having a little bit of struggles in that Mercedes in that testing session. So I think that's going to carry out throughout this season. They don't have quite the feel for that Mercedes as they would have liked through this era here. So they're going to lag behind the Ferraris and McLarens, but they're going to be able to kind of squeeze out Red Bull into that third position, I believe, and be able to take advantage of those situations and push Red Bull out in that regard, but not really be super competitive into that Ferrari McLaren era of where we are today. And then this pushes this to Ferrari and McLaren. I think those are the two teams that are going to be really fighting for that number one constructors standing in the 2025 season. But I think McLaren's going to be able to push it and edge out Ferrari in this running. I think those two drivers are going to be really familiar with that in McLaren and how it handles, where Ferrari is still kind of into that development stage, trying to get everything working. And of course, with Lewis coming in, he's going to be not quite as familiar with the way Ferrari does things. And so I think that's going to hurt them just slightly, but that'll help them in the long run in that 2026 season over the 2025 season. So I think McLaren's going to edge out and become the second Constructors champion in a row for them and really edge out that. Well, of course, we'll have to wait and see how that all plays out because anything can happen. It's really hard to gauge just looking at this last year, where everybody started off in the season and how they looked in that testing phase and where they ended up overall. I mean, I was really surprised by Haas this season, where they ended up compared to where I was thinking they were going to end up, and some other areas like that. So who knows what's going to actually play out in this 2025 season. I'm really excited to see how those things, work race to race and see if those can really be pushed to the limit and get us really excited for this season. So what's coming up next, of course, is the first race of the 2025 season in Australia on March 16th at Albert Park circuit. The circuit has a length of 3.279 miles and it'll be run for 58 laps for a total race distance of 190.217 miles. It was first introduced in 1996 and the lap record holder currently is Charles Leclerc in 2024 with 1 minute 19.813 seconds. So good to see how things are going to play out at Australia. Nice to see them back in that front runner position for the season. I always loved having Australia being the first race of the season and playing out how well things are going to lay out in this regard. So until then, I will see you on the grid and farewell.